Hello, and welcome back to the Vulgar Eclectic if you've been here before, and welcome for the first time if that's the case. I mentioned a while ago that I had recently picked up some comics, and that's actually happened over the course of a few months, a few different trips to a local used bookstore. Actually, they carry a lot of different things, books, music primarily, but they also oftentimes have some cheap comics and a trip to a comic shop as well. The comic shop was when I was visiting some family. It's one I'd never been to before, and that's usually fun to check out something like that. So I thought I would just show some of the comics and a few of the books I picked up on these visits. I'm inserting a quick note here. Actually, I didn't show any of the books because I think I'll do that in a separate video. Alrighty, so to begin with, well, actually this first one I got in the mail. The other ones I got more or less in person, but the first one I'll show you is from the mail. And that's the Kitty Pryde Wolverine 6-issue limited series from Marvel. They came out in, 1984. And these are not a series I've read before. So I'm looking forward to it. And look at that cover. Isn't that great? These are, these appear to be unread. I don't think anyone ever read these. I think someone picked them up and just put them in a bag right away. So they're really in nice shape. I'm not sure how this microphone is going to be working because I'm moving around more than I usually do recording a video. So this is a bit of an experiment, but we'll see. All right, and these are just some odds and ends I picked up. Most of them I got out of a dollar bin at a used bookstore. Kitty Pryde one again. That's actually what made me want to get the full series. That's an interesting looking one. It's an annual, actually, an Avengers annual from 1982. Nebulon on the cover. Oh, and here are a couple of ROM issues. ROM is a Space Knight. Actually, I already have this one, but I mean, that's so cool. So I got it again. That's a really fun storyline. Wolverine issue. Here's stories. I already have this one too, but I have the 4-issue series, and I love it. First of all, I love the painted covers. All 4 of them have those painted covers that were quite popular in the 80s. Bill Sienkiewicz. He did a number of these in the 80s, and they're just beautiful. This storyline is really fun. It's basically, in the future, humanity has made the Earth more or less uninhabitable through warfare, I believe. And they built these series of robots to take care of them and take care of the Earth in their absence, in the absence of humans. Humans have put themselves into some sort of state of suspended animation and have programmed these robots to care for them until the Earth is healed enough that humans can live on the surface again. But some of the robots have reinterpreted their programming or gone against their programming and have become essentially antithetical to human existence. So there's 2 factions, one vying for the humans and one against, and it's the story of how they deal with each other. It's very good. It's actually just for a toy line from the 80s, but I love the comic series. This is Unity, Time is Not Absolute, from the company Valiant that began in the 90s. It was Jim Shooter was an editor and he had a long history in comics as a writer and then various levels of management, and became the editor at Marvel in the 80s. Eventually was let go from Marvel, and he formed his own comic company, or a new comic company called Valiant, and that's a long story and very interesting in itself. But Unity was its great crossover event, and it is really cool. It is a great story and a great comic universe. Again, I already have this comic too, but I found it in the dollar bin and couldn't resist. Most of my comics are in storage, so it's fun to have some out and about again. The Ever-Loving Blue-Eyed Thing. This is Marvel 2-in-1. All these Marvel 2-in-1s feature the Thing and one other character. They meet up and have some sort of an adventure. They often fight each other first before realizing that they would be better off working together. but I love Marvel 2-in-1. The writing is usually pretty funny, and it's a cool way to be introduced to other characters in the Marvel universe. Really like Marvel 2-in-1. This is an old Flash Gordon from 1966. Again, love the painted covers. Double-sized issue of the New Mutants. Bart Simpson's Treehouse of Horror. I don't know how I came across that one. Micronauts. That's another great series from the 80s, based on a toy line. They came from inner space. They're very small creatures. This is Acro Year, which is, what a wonderful name, Acro Year. Very fun stories. And then they came out with the New Voyages after the original series came to an end. This interesting looking one from King Comics, The Phantom. I've never read one of those before. This is interesting, from the 80s black and white explosion of comics that happened in the mid-80s. This is Galactic Patrol Lensman from Eternity Comics #3. And before seeing this comic, I never realized that these even existed. It's an adaptation of E. Doc Smith's space opera series of books that he wrote, The Lensman. So this is interesting. I've read some E. Doc Smith, and it's pretty fun. It's very, very fast-paced, rousing space adventures. And this comic adaptation looks pretty fun. Strike Force Morituri is a series I've read. Another great series from the 80s, and this one is actually really creative, really unique. Martians, or aliens rather, have taken over the Earth, conquered the Earth, and Earth people are fighting back in this resistance war. And they develop a process called the Morituri process, which grants people who undergo it unique and very powerful, usually forces, very powerful powers that allow them to more ably combat the aliens. However, the drawback is that once a person undergoes the Morituri process, they have a very finite amount of time to live. The power basically consumes the person and kills them in a relatively short matter of time, although nobody knows for sure how long each person has to live who goes under the Morituri process. So the comic follows the somewhat brief lives of a team of people who have undergone this process and their fight against the aliens. And it's actually very interesting because for a lot of reasons. One thing, the art is fantastic as well. For most of the series, it's very good. Brent Anderson, I believe, was the illustrator, the penciler for a lot of them, and I really like his artwork. The story asks lots of interesting questions, though, about resistance, violence, terrorism, what constitutes freedom fighters versus terrorism, some of those classic questions, and it really makes one think about contemporary issues, especially if one has some knowledge or experience in some of those situations that are happening and have happened in modern times. This is a series I've read many of. I already have this one, but again, I saw it in the dollar bin, and I just love this series. It's again from the 80s black and white expansion of comics, independent comics. This is from Arrow Comics. In fact, this issue #2 is the first one I ever came across in this series. I was in another city for a soccer tournament, and we went to a used bookstore, my family and I, and they had grab bags with multiple comics in them, and you could really only see the first comic, and maybe had half a dozen comics in a bag. And one of the comics that was visible in one of the grab bags was a Star Wars comic book. I was really into Star Wars, so I bought the grab bag. And in that grab bag was this issue #2 of The Realm, and I read that and right away wanted to track down more of them, although they were quite hard to find back then. The Realm. It follows a group of friends. It starts off, they go to an uncle's cabin, and they find basically a portal to another world, which is sort of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, except these are older people. They're college-aged people. And they are transported to this world, and right off the bat are thrust into very precarious and wild experiences, and meet some friends and make some enemies. And it's a very, very fun series, black and white, really interesting illustration. It switched eventually, I think around issue 13, maybe something like that. 15, I don't remember for sure, to Caliber Comics. And they continued the series for a while. One of the reasons I enjoyed reading this so much when I was younger is that I was very into a series of books called The Guardians of the Flame by Joel Rosenberg. Not the Joel Rosenberg who writes contemporary political thrillers, I think. This writer, Joel Rosenberg, has actually passed away. He wrote fantasy and science fiction books. I've read several of his books in both genres, and actually I've read a mystery by him as well. I was at a used bookstore in a city once when we were on a trip. My family was on a trip to a national track meet, actually. We stopped at this used bookstore, and I was browsing through the fantasy section because at that point in my life I read a lot of fantasy. And this person who was talking with the proprietor, they seemed to be friends, came over and asked what I was looking for, and I said something like I was only browsing and wasn't looking for anything in particular. And he said, "Oh, you like fantasy? Well, I really highly recommend this." And he pulled off the shelf a hardcover collection that had the first three Guardians of the Flame novels in it. And I remember this book was so neat. It was so interesting. In the inside cover, somebody had drawn a picture of a person. And for some reason, it just seemed so interesting to me. So I picked it up. Well, and this guy was very enthusiastic about it. So I picked that up at the used bookstore, and I started reading it on the trip. And I couldn't set it down. I could hardly focus or think about the track meet, which was okay because I tended to get very nervous about that kind of stuff. But I just became so enthralled with this series, and I read those. I just read like crazy on the trip back home, I remember. And the timing was really interesting because it was one of the few times in my life when I caught up with the books that had been published and was actually eagerly awaiting the new one that was due to come out any time. And I remember getting that new off the shelf, and I read it in a day, in a single sitting. I just loved it. The series featured a group of friends who played a fantasy role-playing game and ended up being sent to a fantasy world and their adventures there. And so in my mind, the similarities are, pretty apparent, but in my mind, I always associated the realm with the Guardians of the Flame. It almost seemed like a comic book adaptation of it in a way. Samurai. This is another one. I had the first one I'd picked up somewhere, some grab bag when I was a kid or something. Another black and white comic from the 80s, so it was fun to get the second one in that. This is an older Fantastic Four. Look at that. I love the cover. And an older Captain America. This one I actually bought at a comic book store when I was visiting family. It's a great cover. I haven't read it yet. First Comics. First Comics was a great company back in the 80s. And John Sable is one that I haven't read very many of. I've read several of their series, though. The series Mars is one of my favorite comic book series, and that came out by First. John Sable is some sort of my understanding is kind of a combination of a detective and adventurer. Gem, Son of Saturn is a series I've read. It's a 12-issue series from DC. It's somewhat like an E.T. story where a Earth child meets an alien and forms a relationship. It's actually very good. I don't know how this one got in this mix, but Turok #1, which is kind of funny. When I was a kid, I thought Turok was going to be, well, up to that point, most Valiant #1s that had come out had dramatically increased in value. So this was my attempt at speculation. The only problem is me and 175,000 other people had the same idea. So everybody and their brother bought multiple copies of Turok, and they were essentially worth nothing. But it's a fun story. I like Turok. I think that's a Bart Sears cover. Yeah. And it's back in the day when they had all the foil covers and chromium covers and all this kind of craziness, all these gimmicks to try and sell comics. But again, it is a good story. It's based on the old Turok character from Dell Comics, or Gold Key into Dell Comics. There were Turok, Valiant bought Turok, Solar Man of the Atom, Magnus Robot Fighter, some of those characters, and made them into really interesting stories. And then I got a number of, out of the dollar bin at that one store, some Star Trek, DC Star Trek comics from the 80s, a series I've never read before, and never really had been that interested in reading it, but I think it might be kind of fun, actually. And again, it's always fun to find a new series to read, so I got a number of those that I think will be fun to read. I like this cover in particular. Oh, speaking of Magnus, here are 2 Magnus Robot Fighter comics I picked up. I used to read these when they came out on the newsstand. Read Valiant, I mean. There's just a couple of the later issues with Magnus. Oh, and then I picked up a few, again, out of the dollar bin, some G.I. Joe comics, because those are fun. Couple of the G.I. Joe special missions. Oh, and here's a character I typically really enjoy. Thor. This one I got at that same comic book store where I got that earlier Captain America. The Challenge of the Crypto Man. It sounds appropriate for 2023. This one is the dollar bin, I believe. I can't remember. I might have gotten it at that comic. Actually, I think I might have gotten it at the comic book store. I can't remember. The Midgard Serpent, strike, O devourer of worlds. Either thou or Thor shall die this day. Isn't that great? I love it. The monster whose mammoth coils can crush the earth. The Midgard Serpent. I love it. And then a later Thor 373 from the 80s. That's a Walter Simonson cover. He was a very popular artist back then. His wife was a great writer, Louise Simonson, I believe is her name. They often collaborated on various stories. That's a cool cover. He gave Thor for that era, somewhat iconic beard. Here's another one. Actually, I already have this comic as well. It was one of the early comics I had when I was a child. I have no idea how I came across it or where I got it, but it's a great story with the Morlocks who live in the sewer system, these mutants who live in the sewer system, and I can't remember the bad guys right now who are trying to kill the Morlocks. X-Factor is working to defend them, and Thor helps in this issue. Very good story. And then I picked up 3 issues of a 4-issue Nightcrawler series. I love miniseries from the 80s. They tend to be really fun stories. I haven't read this one yet, so I'm looking forward to that. I got to get the first one, and then I'll read them. And here are 2 DP7 from what's called the New Universe in the late 80s in Marvel, mid to late 80s in Marvel. Jim Shooter decided to try this idea. He thought it would be a good way to introduce new characters to readers. I believe he started this thing called the New Universe, which wanted to create a comic book universe that was separate from the traditional Marvel universe and featured a world in which it would be a more realistic response to superpowered individuals. I think that was part of the setting. DP7, I think, is displaced paranormals, and there are 7 of them on this team. And I didn't read these until much later in life. I had never been very attracted to the New Universe comics. I didn't think they looked very good, but I gave them a try. I found some at a thrift store several years ago and picked them up, and I absolutely loved them. Actually, they were amazingly well written and very, very, very engaging. So I've already got those 2, I believe, but picked them up. Well, actually, I don't know if I have this later one. I can't remember, but at any rate, good stories. And then in the dollar bin, I found a bunch of Uncanny X-Men that I picked up from the 80s because those are typically pretty fun stories. Some of these I already have in my comics that are in storage, but picked them up anyway. I won't spend too much time on them, but just show you some of the covers. Some of them are so iconic. 20th anniversary issue. Storm with her mohawk. Yikes. Rogue. Ooh, Rogue and Storm. Ooh. Love the artwork in this. Barry Windsor Smith is the person who did the cover on this. He has such a distinctive style. He did some of the early Conan adaptations and Conan stories for Marvel, among many other things. He did Weapon X, for example. He's just great. And not only his, especially when he does his own colors. He did Machine Man 2020, and when he does his own colors, he has a distinctive color palette of pinks and purples that just complement his art and create such a wonderful atmospheric universe of illustration and art and color. Can't recommend his stuff enough. Oh, this is a pretty iconic cover. Power Pack, a great collection of superpowered children whose parents have been abducted by aliens in their own comic, and then Wolverine interacts with them, because Wolverine and kids is just always a good combination. Sentinels. Frightful Four. Oh, there's another Barry Windsor Smith cover. Now we're getting kind of later. Ooh, this is Longshot. He had his own series for a little while, limited series, I believe. Ann Nocenti wrote the story, and I think Arthur Adams illustrated it. It's a fantastic series to read, a mini series to read. Just great. His superpower is kind of, I can't remember exactly how it's described, but it's basically being lucky. It's great. Hence his name, I guess, Longshot. But Ann Nocenti just wrote some great stories. And Arthur Adams is a beautifully intricate artist. And there we go. Giant-sized annual. I like picking up, even when sometimes I'll find a comic that isn't a series I have been collecting very extensively, but if it's a giant-sized annual or special issue, I oftentimes get it because it's so much more to read, and oftentimes the stories are very epic and sometimes self-contained, so it's a nice way to read about a character or a team without having to find a lot of different comics. Okay, I think that's... Oh, I also have a bunch... Oh, there's a few more, just a moment. These came from the mail, actually. I got them. I was thinking about getting them for a friend. It's a series I've already read and have. The Eternals, a 12-issue limited series. Very fun. But here's one of the original series. It's number 9, Jack Kirby art. That's wonderful. Then the rest are just more from the limited series that came out later in the 80s. And then this one was a later comic from the 90s. It just came with it when I got it. Actually, I don't really tend to like mini comics from this era as much anyway, but I do really like Mark Texeira's art. I think he's just a phenomenal artist. He did a stint on Wolverine back when I was collecting him off the newsstand, and I can't remember who wrote while he was illustrating, but the series at that point was really, really neat. It was very confusing, but in a good way. It was very dreamlike, and his artwork complemented it so well. He used these bold, dark outlines, and I just really, really like his art. And he happens to do the cover on this Eternals. And then I picked up a bunch of Arak's Son of Thunder comics. There's a number of them, so I won't show them all, but I'll just show this one as kind of an example. Arak's Son of Thunder. Really fun series. They follow Arak, who is a Eastern Coast Native American from a tribe called the Quantaka, a fictional tribe in the DC universe. And this is Valda, the Iron Maiden. It's a great story. He's out on the coast in a boat and gets washed out further to sea, I believe, and a Viking ship picks him up, It takes him to Europe, and it's basically historical with fantasy elements, magic and things like that. So it's based in a roughly historical world, the Carolingian era. Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne, is a character. It's basically his adventures in this, what to him is a new world. Pretty cool story. I like how it mixes history and fantasy. Well, those are most of the comics I have picked up recently. Hope you found that somewhat interesting. If you have any thoughts or comments, please put them below. And I will end this video with some words of wisdom that were given to me by my father once upon a time. He told me, never pet a dog that's on fire. Until next time, thanks and happy reading.